Hello and welcome everyone. We are getting started with our briefing on our analysis of the governor's budget address and the governor's budget. We're going to be getting started in just a moment. This meeting is being recorded and will also be live streamed on Facebook. We're just giving everyone a moment to get into the meeting and then we will get started with the presentation. So thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Levana Layendecker. I'm the Associate Director with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, and we are going to get started in just a moment. I just want to let everyone know who just joined us that this meeting is being recorded and also streamed on Facebook Live. And in just a moment, we will go ahead and turn it over. Just want to make sure that everyone is in the meeting. We have a lot of folks joining us today, which is very exciting. And we're really excited to have you all here. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over. Welcome. This is the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center analysis of the governor's budget. And we'll begin with Mark Steer, who is the director for the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. Thanks, Mark. Mark, you need to unmute.
We're here today to talk about the governor's budget proposal, his speech today, and the budget that he's released as well. I'm going to open it up with some general remarks about the budget as a whole. Then I'm going to turn it over to Susan Spicka, the Executive Director of Education Voters, who's going to talk about education spending in the budget. Then Reesa Kossoff, the Executive Director of SEIU State Council, is going to talk about the minimum wage. Then Steve Herzenberg, the Executive Director of Keystone Research Center, will talk about workforce development and career and technical education. And Diana Polson from our senior policy analyst at the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center will talk about human services. And then may have some general discussion or take some of your questions. So to begin, Governor Shapiro's first budget, on our view, sets all the right priorities, the ones he campaigned in support of in the 2020 election, and the ones that the voters overwhelmingly supported. He understands the importance of educating not just children, but adults, and calls for investing more in pre-K, K-12 education, higher education, as well as workforce training and career and technical education. He shows us that he understands that we must create higher paying jobs, and he calls for raising the minimum wage. He also calls for helping new businesses that will generate high-wage jobs get established and grow in the state by helping them secure the well-trained workers they need, and also to help them gain access to new technologies, technical assistance, and capital. He broadens the state's efforts in this regard by investing more in the arts as well, which is an important economic driver as well as an important cultural touchstone for all of us. He understands that it's become increasingly difficult to recruit nurses, teachers, and police officers, and proposes a refundable tax credit to help attract them to our local governments, schools, and hospitals. He understands that the government-supported safety net provides critical services and proposes new investments for seniors, individuals with disabilities, families who have difficulty affording childcare, and those who need health care. He understands that rural communities and urban communities and suburban communities all suffer from similar problems and all need state support to revive themselves and thrive. And he recognized that Pennsylvanians have a right to clean air and pure water and proposes new investments to protect them. These initiatives, which we will discuss in some detail soon, are all exactly right, and the priorities he put forward today are exactly right. Yet while Governor Shapiro's priorities are right, we believe that the level of new spending he's proposing in many of these areas is too low. The total general fund budget increases by almost 8%, and that may sound like a lot, but at a time when the consumer price index increased by almost the same amount in 2022, and is projected by the administration to increase by 4% in 2023, the budget barely keeps pace with inflation. Indeed, as a share of gross state product, the budget is almost exactly the same as it was last year at 4.71%, which is a historically low level. And the low level of new investment in some critical areas is especially disappointing when the state is flush with cash. With a budget surplus that the governor's proposal expects will reach $7.8 billion by the end of this fiscal year on June 30th, which is very similar to our own projection from a few weeks ago. And when there's $5 billion in the rainy day fund, we think there's an opportunity for greater investments in many of the critical priorities that the governor identified. We always take 7-year financial statements that accompanies the executive budget with a grain of salt, but we're concerned that it presents a plan to cover projected operating deficits in the next 5 years, with first the surplus in the general fund and then the rainy day fund. Spending over these 5 years is projected to grow only with inflation. If this plan is followed beyond next year, the state will not have invested sufficiently in the critical areas we're talking about, especially educational levels from pre-K to higher education and workforce development. We understand that new governors have an almost Herculean task in preparing a budget in their first year in office, and we are at a highly uncertain economic moment when the pandemic and a fast economic recovery from it has led to a period of inflation, as well as other economic dislocations that we're only starting to understand. So perhaps this budget is meant to temporize as Governor Shapiro and the rest of us evaluate the current situation more deeply. Still, given the needs, especially for meeting the challenge of fully and fairly funding K-12 education, and to meeting the requirements set by the recent Commonwealth Court decision issued by Judge Jubileer, we can't but hope that the governor's budget will be a starting point for efforts in the General Assembly to increase spending in some areas beyond what the governor's proposed. And with that general overview, let me turn it over to Susan Spicka from Education Voters.
Hi there. Thank you, Mark, for just laying out the landscape here. And I just want to echo what Mark said about we have this Commonwealth Court funding decision. And, clearly the governor acknowledged that. But at this moment, the funding that he has proposed is inadequate in this year. And we really I think he understands we need to find a solution. He has talked about going to the table to find a solution. But in the immediate year, when we have students sitting in classrooms where we know they are being educated in closets and they have roofs that are leaking and they don't have the materials they need to succeed, this is a moment in time with the $12 billion surplus and rainy day fund when we were hoping to see a larger investment proposed by Governor Shapiro, and where we are very optimistic that we can see something more than this if we work with the General Assembly. So Governor Shapiro's budget for K-12 education includes a $567 million increase in basic education funding that will go to all 500 school districts through the basic education funding formula. And while that sounds like a lot, it is a 7.8% increase, which Mark referenced is the rate of inflation. When we look at special education, there is a $103.8 million increase, which is also a 7.8% increase, the rate of inflation. So these increases are only helping school districts to barely tread water. In a moment in Pennsylvania, when we have that court ruling that shows that we have such deep inadequacies in our school funding. We're grateful for those proposed investments, but we really need to have more to move the needle. And then what was a little bit surprising and actually quite disappointing was that the Level Up supplement was not proposed in this budget at all. And so Level Up funding was in the past 2 budgets. It is special supplemental funding that is driven to the 100 school districts in Pennsylvania that have the fewest resources available to meet their students' needs. It is intended to drive dollars to school districts that have the greatest needs and lift them up so that we can start to close these great inequities. And so it was a little surprising not to see that, because it has had huge support, bipartisan support across the state in rural, urban, and suburban districts. Governor Shapiro proposed a new $100 million state appropriation that would be annual for the next 5 years for environmental repairs and improvements in schools. We have had no state funding at all for any type of school construction since 2016. So this is a very welcome investment, but given the state of our school facilities, it's a very tiny investment. And the perfect way to use a rainy day fund would be to take money out of the one-time money out of the rainy day fund to school construction projects, as we saw in Senator Hughes's budget that was proposed. We also see an increase of $100 million for school mental health services. There aren't a lot of details about that. $100 million divided by the number of schools, students in schools works out to about $60 per student. So this is not like some kind of comprehensive mental health support that is going to allow school districts to hire the professionals they need to meet the moment where students are struggling with their mental health needs. But it is an investment that will help start to move the needle in the right direction. Governor Shapiro also proposed $38.5 million increase to annualize the universal free breakfast for students, which is a very positive for schools, so that they don't have to worry about what to do if they have to cut free breakfast for students. And then there's a lot about career and technical education, but I'm going to pass that over to Steve to talk about the K-12 funding. From Ed Voters' point of view, the investment in higher education was incredibly disappointing. In particular, there was a 2% increase for the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, an $11 million increase. We know that students in Pennsylvania graduate with the third highest debt when they graduate from college in the nation, because state support for higher education is so paltry. And so if we want to have professionals in our communities, if we want to be able to open up our teacher pipeline, we need to see substantial investments in higher education so that higher education can be affordable. If we had affordable higher education, we would have enough teachers in Pennsylvania. But when students have to take on a mountain of debt to become a teacher, it just is something that is unsustainable for them. So Governor Shapiro proposed having college presidents come together to talk about the higher education system. But what they really need right now is like some funding so that they can bring down tuition so students can actually afford to realize the dream of higher education. Okay, so I'm done with education, and I will pass it over to the next person. So thank you.
Thanks, Susan. We're going to go to Reesa Kossoff, who's going to talk about minimum wage and anything else she wants to talk about.
Thanks, Mark. And I feel like kind of a broken record, to be completely honest, because I think, I've been in this role for 8 years, and I think this is like my 7th time coming onto this forum to talk about the minimum wage. And frankly, I'm really sick of it. So like, let's get it done this year, finally, because it's been 17 years since Pennsylvania took action on this thing. And let's get it done in a way that is sustainable, so we don't have to keep fighting the inertia of 17 years of inaction in the General Assembly. So all of that being said, I want to start with what the governor said in his speech today, which was that Pennsylvania needs to have a $15 minimum wage, which we understand to mean we need a $15 minimum wage yesterday. So for those who have been following along this budget presentation for the Wolf administration, you'll know that Governor Wolf, in his minimum wage proposal way back in 2015, at the beginning of the first term of his administration, started out with a $12 minimum wage that then advanced over time to $15. If you account for inflation, that $12 minimum wage that was proposed back in 2015 would now be worth $15.15 today. So 15 is what we need yesterday in order to get Pennsylvanians what they need to be able to actually have a living, sustainable wage. So all of that being said, I want to talk a little bit about the things that we need to be thinking about so that I don't have to come in front of this group every single year and talk about how the legislature needs to go ahead and take action on the minimum wage issue. So again, for those of you who've been following along, one of the things that you might remember from Governor Wolf's minimum wage proposals was the issue of lifting preemption. And that is fancy Harrisburg jargon for ensuring that local counties and municipalities have the ability to raise wages on their own, giving the power to our local elected leaders to be able to meet the needs of their communities, their economies, their workers, their businesses, and their voters, right? Back in 2006, the last time Pennsylvania took action to raise the minimum wage, and by the way, a really sad fact is Pennsylvania's state minimum wage is actually $7.15, not $7.25. The reason that it is $7.25 is because the federal government raised it to $7.25 in 2009. So sad fact, Pennsylvania's minimum wage, according to state law, is actually lower than the federal minimum wage. We really need to do something about this. So in 2006, when it was raised to $7.15, the trade for that was to preempt local governments from being able to raise wages on their own. Imagine what we could do if our cities and counties across the state were able to raise wages on their own. We would be able to have a real dialogue about what makes sense in a particular region, because just like the needs of California are not the same as the needs of Pennsylvania, the needs of Erie County aren't the same as the needs of Bucks County, aren't the same as the needs of Philadelphia, aren't the same as the needs of Johnstown, right? So we need to get 15 done this year and then be able to give local communities the ability to raise wages as they see fit into the future. I would also say that this would take the action on minimum wage out of the hands of the legislature. And having lobbied on this issue for years and years and years, we understand that if you talk to 203 representatives, 50 senators, and the governor, everybody will give you a very different number of what they think the minimum wage should be in Pennsylvania, and getting to an agreement to get this over the finish line has proved extraordinarily difficult. So in essence, we know there's so much alignment across the labor community, across many of our community partners in Pennsylvania, to say enough is enough on this. Let's get 15 done, and let's make sure that we don't have to fight this fight for another 17 years. And let's give our local governments the opportunity to get this done for their voters. And so I will wrap it up with that. And Mark, turning it back to you.
Thanks, Reesa. I'm going to turn it over now to Steve Herzenberg, who's going to talk about career training and workforce development and related issues.
Thanks, Mark. So one of the most innovative parts of Governor Shapiro's proposed budget would invest nearly $25 million to establish much stronger links between education and training, including career and technical education, and industries that pay well and have jobs in demand. There's a lot to like in the specific investments in that $25 million, in part because they recognize the need for system building that connects education and training to industry. Creating the too often missing link between education and the economy can deliver a triple bottom line: higher paying careers for students and workers, better skills for employers, a stronger economy for Pennsylvania and our communities. Three examples of the system building that Governor Shapiro would invest in: $3.5 million for a new Pennsylvania Schools to Work program that supports workforce development partnerships between schools and employers and industry associations, partnerships that would create robust training and career pathways. $2 million to establish a state industry in the schools program that will pay for industry professionals to teach and build interest among students in the classroom. $3 million to cover a portion of the in-classroom instruction for registered apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships. Every other country with levels of apprenticeship an order of magnitude higher than the United States achieves that through public-private co-investment, with the public sector paying for the classroom instruction. These other countries include England, which 20 years ago had low levels of apprenticeship like Pennsylvania, but now has levels more like Germany. So $3 million is only a starter investment in terms of public-private co-investment in apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship, but it's a strategic one, and and points in the direction of a deeper co-investment at a larger scale down the road. In sum, the governor's CTE, career and technical education, and apprenticeship, pre-apprenticeship proposals have most of the elements of the systemic reform proposed by Keystone Research Center and Children First in a white paper that we released last week, and that was part of the Pennsylvania Schools Work campaign. I'll put the link for that white paper in the chat. The governor also proposes $12 million for three programs that directly support career and technical education schools, $3.3 million for technology and equipment, $4 million to expand CTE and healthcare, STEM, energy and infrastructure trades, $5 million for computer science and STEM programs. Here's the but, and it's kind of similar to the but in terms of the budget as a whole. The level of funding for CTE, particularly for the core subsidy for CTE education, is insufficient to move Pennsylvania's enrollment in CTE up from its current 1/3 of the average level in our surrounding states. So less than 7% of Pennsylvania students concentrate in CTE versus an average of 19% in surrounding states. Given the strong bipartisan support for CTE, the legislature has an opportunity to enhance Governor Shapiro's strategic investments in industry-aligned education and training with a bump in the state CTE subsidy. The current, Susan's word, paltry state of the CTE subsidy only amounts to 8.5% of CTE costs. Because of that, districts are often reluctant to send students to career and technical centers, and that in turn helps explain our low level of enrollment. So that inadequate core subsidy is the major bottleneck to move Pennsylvania students enrolling, to increase the number of Pennsylvania students enrolling in evidence-based career-related learning. You know, we'd proposed a 200 million increase in that. There isn't an increase, so that's where we need to do more. Back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Steve. Now we're going to turn it over to Diana Polson, who's going to talk about the huge subject of human services and the safety net. Go ahead, Diana.
All right.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So yeah, as Mark said, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know so far about the human services budget. You know, Governor Shapiro proposes a $19 billion general fund budget for human services, which is 43% of the total general fund budget. So we'll be learning more over the next couple of weeks, and we'll obviously give a more detailed analysis at our budget summit. But in general, you know, the human services budget kind of mirrors the rest of the budget proposal here that people have been talking about, that many of the priorities are on point, but funding increases are in many cases not enough to meet the need. So this obviously points to the need we have in Pennsylvania to come up with new recurring and reliable sources of revenue from those with the most ability to pay. So we can, you know, fund the things that we need to support communities and families in Pennsylvania. But in the area of human services, there are two particular areas where the governor has focused new spending, and that's in the area of mental health care and services to support the elderly and people with disabilities. On mental health care, the governor has proposed $100 million through the school-based mental health supports block grant to do two things: strengthen mental health supports for students and staff, and to bolster the pipeline of mental health professionals trained for this work in schools. He's also proposed a $20 million increase in base funding for community-based mental health services, so counties can provide mental health services and also support the growth of the workforce. Additional funding around mental health, you know, he talked about in his speech, you know, will be invested in suicide prevention call centers. And he also mentioned, you know, in his written materials, farmers' mental health services. The governor also proposes new spending to assist seniors and individuals with disabilities through a variety of programs. One of the things he highlighted in his budget address is, you know, the proposal to expand eligibility and benefits for the property tax and rent rebate program. And this is a program that helps the elderly and people with disabilities keep their homes through tax relief. But because, you know, eligibility standards have been stagnant, fewer people are benefiting from the program. So with this change, an additional 173,000 people would receive assistance, and the benefits would increase. The other thing he's doing with this proposal, he proposes the same eligibility standards for homeowners and renters, which, you know, we see as a long overdue change. Another proposal Governor Shapiro makes is an additional $10 million to decrease the wait list for the options program. And this is a program that helps older people stay in their homes because, you know, as Pennsylvania ages, we know that many older people in Pennsylvania prefer to age in place. Another proposal the governor makes is around SNAP benefits, and he talked about a little bit about that today. The federal SNAP emergency allotment ended last month, which gave people access to increased food stamps. But the ending of this federal expansion, along with kind of the increase in food prices, will unfortunately increase food insecurity in our state. So he's proposed a $16 million investment to increase the minimum SNAP benefits from 23% or $23 a month to $35 a month. And it's noted that over 100,000 Pennsylvanians receive this minimum SNAP benefit, so would see the increase. But it's also important to note, even though an increase is wanted and needed, this barely makes up for the loss in federal SNAP, the federal SNAP emergency allotment ending. Just a couple other things to note in human services. Governor Shapiro proposes new funding for individuals with an intellectual disability and/or autism. He proposes $17.5 million in state funds that will serve an additional 750 people in the community living waiver and 100 people in the consolidated waiver programs. And these are programs that help individuals live more independently in their homes and communities. And an area where we see the governor's intentions are good, but his spending proposal, seems too low, is with regard to funding for childcare works. He proposes additional spending to ensure that up to 75,000 low-income families remain in the program. But from what we can tell, he does not propose enough money to make a dent in the large waiting list of families who are eligible but not able to get into a program. And with that, I'm gonna stop and turn it back over to Mark. Thanks.
Thanks, Diana. So if I can sum up, we didn't plan all this, our various presentations together, but you can see there's some similar themes. We think Governor Shapiro is heading in the right direction. His priorities really do match those of the people of Pennsylvania. His goals are things we all support, but we think in a lot of ways there's not enough funding for many of them. Now, we should be clear, the fact that there's not enough money in the state government's budget for so many things we talked about, from education, K-12 education to higher education to workforce training to career and technical services to human services of all kinds, is not just Governor Shapiro's fault. Let's be clear. He comes into a situation in which, as we've been saying at PBPC for many years, state spending has been far too low in many of these areas. Minimum wage, we've been far behind, as Reesa pointed out. We all know that, as Judge Jubileer said, we've been underfunding education and inequitably funding education for decades. Higher education funding has been dropping for 30 years. Career and technical education is inched up under Governor Wolf, but is still far from where it should be. And of course, the human services problems that Diana pointed out, childcare, waiting lists, and inadequate funding for food stamps is not just a state problem, but a federal problem, and something we've all been dealing with for a very long time. So why are we focusing on this? Well, partly because that's what we do. We need, our job is to help people of Pennsylvania understand the real needs of Pennsylvanians and why and how the state government can meet them. But there are two other things we're aware of. One is that there's a huge amount of money in the state surplus right now. We're looking at an $8 billion surplus at the end of June. We have $5 billion in the rainy day fund. Some of that money could, and we think should, be spent on meeting some of these priorities. There's not enough to meet every single one of these priorities we talked about at the level they deserve, but there's certainly enough money for a little higher investment. And second, frankly, because of the shift in the General Assembly. We know that over the last 8 years in Governor Wolf's term, the governor proposed many spending initiatives that would have addressed the problems we're talking about today, but his budgets were often called dead on arrival when they got to the General Assembly because the Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate. Despite that, Governor Wolf made some progress, and we think there's a chance for greater progress this year, and that's why we're talking about what still needs to be done and how we're hoping that the General Assembly will step forward and raise some of the spending levels that are in this proposed budget. With that overview, I'm going to see if folks have any questions that they'd like us to answer.
So Mark, I sent a couple of questions along to you if you want to get started with those, and then I can send more if people put them in the chat, and then we'll open it up to the whole group.
Sure. I saw one question from Jody Comas about how is this budget funded? it's funded basically with this, the annual revenues, plus the governor's planning to use some of the surplus at the end of this budget this year for next year. In fact, if you look at the 7-year budget proposal, he proposed to spend down the surplus over a couple of years and then use the rainy day fund for a couple of years after that to sustain the budget. Even though the operating deficit each year, the operating budget each year will be in deficit without using these surplus funds. Now, as I said at the beginning, you have to take these 7-year budgets with a grain of salt. Things change. The Governor Shapiro talked today about this is a first of a 2-year budget when it comes to education. And we've been hearing from the administration that's the way they're looking at it, that they may have bigger proposals next year. So that might change, and we may see some other ideas about securing revenues to pay for ongoing budget proposals, including the new initiatives we saw this year. There's a minor tax cut. I saw someone asked about tax cuts, so I would talk about it as well. There's a minor tax cut on cell phone service. It's only going to cost the state about $40 million, and there's going to be a surcharge on I forget. On something else in the I'm forgetting what it is, but there's a surcharge on something else having to do with phone service that'll make up for those losses. Even though the governor's talked about corporate tax cuts and accelerating them, it's not proposed in this budget that we can see. Maybe he expects the General Assembly to move on that, but we don't see anything in the current budget proposal that calls for accelerating corporate tax cuts. And frankly, we think that's a good idea. While we've always supported reducing the corporate net income tax rate from 9.9% about 6.5%, we think dropping that lower is actually not fair. And we think doing any corporate net income tax cuts without instituting combined reporting to ensure that the multinational and multi-state corporations that operate in Pennsylvania and that pay nothing, pay their fair share, is something that should accompany any corporate tax cuts, those that were already passed and any new acceleration of them. There is a proposal, which I don't think the governor mentioned today in his speech, although I did get distracted in a moment, to tax marijuana, adult use marijuana. Of course, to tax it, you first have to make it legal. So we assume the governor will be calling for legalizing that at some point. It doesn't bring in a huge amount of money initially, but our estimates in a paper we put out a couple of years ago is that it could bring $500 million into the state revenue bucket within a couple of years. So that's my take on taxes. Let's see, are there other questions?
So there was a question for Steve. Steve, can you repeat the data for CTEs and what is the percentage that participate in PA versus surrounding states?
Sure. It's the Pennsylvania percentage of kids who concentrate in CTE, which I think is 2 courses or more for at least a couple of years. This is based on federal data that's kept as part of so-called Perkins Act data. So the Pennsylvania share is less than 7%. The arithmetic average of the 6 surrounding states is 19%.
Great, thanks. And Steve or Mark might want to address this, but Barney asked if you could talk about the unemployment funding that the governor discussed.
I'm happy to take that. I'd have to look at the details of the budget. I mean, I wondered whether he was signaling openness to, reviving the service infrastructure fund, or again, in Pennsylvania in recent years, workers contribute to the unemployment insurance trust fund. This has been true since the late 1980s, and again has been running at the level of above $200 million a year in workers' contributions. Unlike the employer contributions to unemployment insurance, which are very limited in terms of how you can use them, you basically have to use them to pay unemployment benefits. It's a form of insurance for workers who lose their job and need partial income replacement. but the workers' contributions are not so constrained. And so the legislature and the Corbett administration kind of discovered that in spades about 11 years ago or 12 years ago, and started to use a big chunk of that money to waste on IT companies. Sorry, no, to spend, to try, and so far fail really, to fix the information technology infrastructure of UC. A little bit of workers' contributions are also used for employee training. Anyway, so it's possible that the governor was signaling some openness to it to see if he could get legislative support for using some of that money to fix the among other things, the IT system supporting UC. I mean, again, I do want to give, the governor made reference to the fact that Secretary Walker has made unemployment compensation one of her first priorities, and we and a bunch of other folks, including Labor and Barney, have been engaged with the administration around getting ahead of the frankly broken UC system in Pennsylvania. So we're very encouraged by that leadership from the governor and from Secretary Walker. And in the end, I think if the administration has a real plan on UC, which includes a plan for spending some more money on more IT systems, if people have confidence that the IT approach has more potential this time, I think they'd probably be supportive.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Mark, I'm sure you'll want to address this, but Art Leopold asked, we all know that the ARPA funds were allocated due to the pandemic and the need that it created. Where is the $8 billion going to be spent instead of hoarding it? And how would you suggest that the governor spend it?
Well, a big chunk of the ARPA funds was put into the general fund. Now there was a federal law that basically said how much of the ARPA funds can be put into the general fund based on the decline in revenues as a result of the pandemic, and I think the state has more or less followed that. So if you want to know where a bunch of the ARPA funds are, about half of them, about 3.8 of the $7 billion, is where the big surplus in the general fund comes from. Now, one could argue that those funds should have been used for other purposes besides building up the general fund balance and then paying for deficits that are going to start arising in the next fiscal year. And I would agree with you about that. There's a certain amount of, to be a little harsh perhaps, a certain amount of money laundering going on, that we take a lot of federal aid, and it wasn't just the ARPA fund. There was it wasn't, I should say, it wasn't just the $3.8 billion of the ARPA fund. There was another about $2 billion that was used to subsidize state spending programs in the last 2 fiscal years. So it's almost $6 billion of ARPA funds went into the state budget, and one could argue that that was a bit too much given federal standards. And it's being used to pay down future deficits. It's also being used to pay down the corporate tax cuts that were instituted last year, which will cost the state by the 5th year, well over $1 billion a year. I hate it when I'm accurate in predicting the future, because I tend to predict pessimistically in recent years. But when ARPA was passed, I said that I was worried that we would use that money to help cut corporate tax cut. The corporate net income tax rate, and that seems to be what's happening. So that's concerning. We would love to see this money that's in the surplus and in the rainy day fund be used to help with many of the priorities that we've talked about today, including for education at all levels and human services.
Okay. There was an additional question from Jordy about the property tax cuts for seniors that Governor Shapiro mentioned, and usually there's a lot of enthusiasm from Republicans on both sides of the aisle on that, but it seemed like there was less enthusiasm for that, and I don't know if you want to comment on those specific property tax relief programs for seniors.
Yeah, they're really good. It's for seniors and for those who are disabled. One of the really good things about it, which the governor did not mention, but I noticed when I was reading the budget this morning, is that the eligibility standards, which have traditionally been far lower for renters than for homeowners, are now equal. So whether you rent or you're a homeowner, you can get the same level of benefits. The benefits have been increased from $650 to $1,000 a year. That's the maximum benefit. So that's a really good thing. It's a good proposal. I think I did notice the same thing you noticed, Jordy, is that when they did a reaction shot when he said this, and the Democrats were all standing up applauding and the Republicans were not. Republicans generally applaud tax cuts. I don't know why they didn't support this one. But I'm probably the wrong person to read the minds of Republicans.
And then Art has one other question. Was there any good news on funding for housing programs and resources for previously housed individuals? I think we just talked about one, which is the rent rebate and property tax relief for seniors and disabled people. I don't know if you want to comment on the whole homes repair.
Yeah, I mean, the governor said two things about home homes repair. One is that they're going to try to get the money out fast, which is always a good thing, but that doesn't mean it's new money. But then he did say that he hopes the program will continue into future years. Until we have a chance to look through the details of the budget book, it's hard to track all this stuff and to even figure out where it is. It's a $125 million program in a $45 billion budget. So we'll find it. But if the governor says it's there they're proposing it for the next few years, and which means proposing it for the fiscal year that begins on July 1st, then I assume it's there, and I hope the General Assembly will go along with it. There wasn't much else on housing. And one of the things that we've been paying more attention to in recent years at the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center is a real housing crisis in many parts of the state. We'll be coming out with some proposals later this year in conjunction with a number of members of the General Assembly who are working with us on this issue for greater state support of housing affordability. But it's becoming, particularly in our bigger cities, but not just there, it's becoming a greater problem in our state, and we need to do more to deal with it. But I didn't speak beyond the property tax rebate program, which I think is really great. I didn't see anything for basically for low income people who are not seniors or disabled.
So we can take one more question from the chat and then we'll open it up for our last 15 minutes. But that Art asked, as former AG, any new funding or direction given for police services or incarceration or prison programs? I know he spent a significant amount of time talking about police.
Yeah, there is a program, not just for police officers, but for teachers and nurses to give a tax credit, a 3-year tax credit of $2,500 a year for people who choose these professions. So that's one thing. There's a proposal to replace the money that comes out of the motor vehicle license fund and goes to the state police with other funding. That doesn't necessarily add to money for the state police, but it does make sure that there's more money available for roads and bridges. There is enough money in this proposal for, I think, 4 new classes of state troopers. And there's probably some other stuff, but I don't recall off the top of my head what else I saw this morning when I read through the budget real quickly.
Thanks, Mark. So Adrian is going to lift the mute so people can unmute themselves for the last few minutes. If anyone has any additional questions at this time, you can unmute yourself and jump in, and we are open. Jordy has his hand raised. I think you can unmute yourself, Jordy.
Well, I mean, call on other people first. I've been hogging.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question? You can raise your hand, or you can, if you can't do that from where you are, you can unmute yourself and jump in. All right, Jordy, I think the floor is yours.
Right.
Go ahead.
So, yeah, thank you. Two things. I happened to be in the chamber, which was not hard. I just went to the gallery. So, Mark, I saw them not applaud on both the cell phone tax and the property tax. And I was just like, I guess, there's no tax cut coming from a Democratic governor that they like the sound of. I mean, that's what I took away. But my real question was on the property tax relief. I was just curious, if it's for tenants, I think that's great. But how do you make sure that landlords pass that on to tenants versus pocket it? Does that make sense?
Individual, I believe individuals apply for it directly. So it doesn't, they don't,
Oh,
Yeah, renters apply for that program directly.
but they're not paying property tax, are they? So they just apply for it and it's assumed that they paid for it through their rent.
yeah, I mean, we know the renters pay property tax indirectly in their rent, so
Gotcha, gotcha.
they get the
Gotcha.
rebate the same way as homeowners do.
Any other questions if people want to unmute themselves? Or if you want to, you can still put questions in the chat. I'm happy to take them there too. Steve just posted something in the chat about property tax relief from a 2014 We the People paper. That is still relevant information.
I took copious notes on who applauded, and I'm happy to transcribe them later. I think the only thing they spontaneously applauded for that wasn't police or firefighters, and he had to nudge them, was the thing about making licensing and registration fees and all of that. They seemed really into that, which I don't know the background of why they're so excited about that.
It does take a long time to get certain state permits. So it would be
No,
good.
I mean, I'm all for that too. I have a small business and it takes forever, but I didn't know why they love that more than other things. I guess because government sounds bad, so they like that.
I'm going to mention one other thing, because sometimes you see really good proposals and details in a line item. There's about $1 million odd dollars for hiring new inspectors at the Department of Labor to ensure that wage standards are met. That includes both prevailing wages in the construction industry and minimum wages. That's a real step forward. And the governor did mention that in his speech, because as Attorney General, he has prosecuted wage theft quite often. I think that's a big advantage for workers. Of course, we have to have a minimum wage that's a little higher than is today to really have that make a big difference. But if we get to $15, then ensuring that people actually pay what they owe would be a wonderful thing. So I did want to mention that, because it's a small amount of money, but sometimes small amounts of money can make a big difference in the lives of people.
All right, I'll give one more chance if anyone wants to unmute or put a question in the chat. We have stopped the Facebook live feed, so you are not on Facebook now, if that makes a difference into whether or not you want to ask a question. All right, I think with that, we can close the questions. Mark, did you have anything that you wanted to say in closing?
No, I just want to thank you all for coming. It's a big turnout this year, bigger than usual. And I hope that says something about our enthusiasm for the possibilities of new directions in the state. And we encourage you all to be active and involved and stay informed, because what happens from here on out really depends on what we all do. I've been looking at the impact of court decisions like the one we just had in education. Sometimes they make a big difference. Sometimes, frankly, they don't. There's been a court decision, I forget which state I was looking at, in North Carolina. There was a court decision about 30 years ago, like the one we just had, and it hasn't had much impact. The big difference I've seen is whether whether advocacy follows the court decision, whether people stay on our political leaders, and to ensure that the requirement set by the courts is met by action of the governor and the General Assembly. So thank you all for being here, and stay involved, because that's what's really going to make a difference when it comes to what the General Assembly does with this budget proposal. So with that, thank you all and have a good day.